Welcome back to our channel, where we explore the compelling, emotionally rich, and psychologically complex storylines unfolding in the dramatic world of Genoa. Today is an exciting day to uncover the dark underbelly of your favorite characters as they venture down treacherous paths of deception, addiction, and suffering, revealing Nick's woes as he develops paranoia due to a drug overdose. Subscribe to our channel for the latest updates. The suffocating atmosphere of a dingy, forgotten motel room on the outskirts of Genoa City served as the grim sanctuary for Nick Newman, a man who had completely abandoned his arduous path to recovery. Having prematurely escaped the structured safety of his rehabilitation facility, Nick found himself entirely isolated, drowning in a profound ocean of despair and chemical dependency. The physical deterioration of the once proud Newman heir was starkly evident in the trembling of his hands and the hollow, haunted look in his eyes. On the battered nightstand beside him, his cellular phone vibrated relentlessly, the glowing screen flashing with increasingly frantic messages from Sharon, Rosales, and Victoria Newman. They were desperate lifelines thrown into a raging storm, but Nick, consumed by the overwhelming, crushing weight of his family's towering expectations and his own catastrophic failures, made the conscious, destructive choice to ignore them. The immense pressure of maintaining the facade of the Golden Boy, the reliable protector of the Newman dynasty, had finally fractured his spirit entirely, driving him to seek the ultimate, numbing escape that only the darkness of his illicit substances could provide. As the heavy, toxic influence of the drugs began to course through his bloodstream, the stark reality of the peeling wallpaper and the flickering neon light outside his window began to dissolve into a terrifying, distorted dreamscape. The transition from the physical world into the dark, labyrinthine recesses of his own fractured psyche was not a gentle descent, but a violent plunge into an abyss crafted from his deepest insecurities and most profound regrets. The air in this subconscious realm grew thick and oppressive, heavy with the scent of impending doom and the palpable manifestation of his mounting guilt. Nick felt himself falling through a void of his own making, a space where the boundaries of time, consequence, and reality were entirely obliterated, leaving him completely vulnerable to the merciless judgment of his own mind. Within this suffocating darkness, the imposing figure of Matt Clark slowly materialized, stepping out of the shadows not as the falsely reformed, eccentric man he had recently pretended to be, but as the true, sinister predator that had haunted the Newman family for decades. The charming facade Matt had carefully constructed for Phyllis Summers was entirely stripped away, revealing a chilling, malevolent presence that radiated pure, unadulterated malice. In this twisted nightmare, Matt assumed the role of a demonic guide, a dark Virgil leading Nick through the personalized inferno of his own catastrophic life choices. Matt's voice, dripping with psychological venom, echoed through the void, meticulously dissecting the true nature of Nick's addiction. He taunted Nick with the horrifying assertion that the drugs were not a punishment, but a perverse liberation. Matt insisted that Nick secretly reveled in the chaotic freedom of his intoxication because it finally absolved him of the suffocating, relentless pressure to be the flawless, morally upright pillar of the Newman family. Driven by an unseen, malevolent force, Matt guided Nick through the distorted landscape until they arrived at a grotesque, neon-drenched nightclub known as the Shadow Room. The environment was a sensory nightmare, pulsating with a chaotic, discordant energy that perfectly mirrored the moral decay rotting away at Nick's soul. Pushing through the throngs of faceless, writhing figures, Nick's eyes locked onto a sight that threatened to shatter his already fragile sanity. There, amidst the squalor and the haze of illicit smoke, was Sharon. The woman he had spent a lifetime fiercely protecting, the mother of his children, was reduced to a hollow, shivering addict, entirely consumed by the very demons Nick had unleashed upon himself. Seeing Sharon in this state of absolute degradation served as the ultimate condemnation of his role as a protector, visually representing the contagious, destructive nature of his own downward spiral. The horror of the scene compounded exponentially when the figure of Mariah Copeland suddenly emerged from the murky shadows of the club. Initially, her presence seemed to signal an impending intervention, an angry daughter arriving to rescue her mother from the depths of despair. However, in the fluid, terrifying logic of the nightmare, Mariah's features began to shift and blur, seamlessly morphing into the ghostly, tragic visage of Cassie Newman. The historical trauma of Cassie's untimely death, a wound that had never truly healed within the Newman family, resurfaced with devastating clarity. Cassie stood before him, her youthful face twisted not in anger, but in a profound, soul-crushing disappointment. She silently communicated the absolute magnitude of his failures as a father, judging him for the chaotic wreckage he had made of his life. In a sudden, shocking burst of symbolic violence, Cassie turned and delivered a vicious slap across Matt Clark's face, a powerful manifestation of the lingering, unavenged trauma Matt had inflicted upon their family, before turning her sorrowful gaze back to her deeply flawed father. Driven by a surge of primal panic and a desperate need to rewrite his failures, Nick grabbed Sharon and dragged her out of the suffocating confines of the shadow room, throwing her into the passenger seat of a waiting vehicle. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, tearing through the distorted streets of his nightmare in a frantic attempt to outrun his demons. The claustrophobia of the speeding car was suddenly shattered by the violent, inexplicable materialization of Adam Newman. Adam appeared in the vehicle with the force of a thunderclap, his face contorted in an expression of pure, murderous rage. Without warning, Adam lunged forward, his hands locking around Nick's throat in a suffocating, lethal grip. The physical struggle for survival within the confined space of the moving vehicle mirrored Nick's desperate, failing battle for control over his own life. Blinded by panic and deprived of oxygen, Nick lost complete control of the steering wheel, sending the vehicle hurtling toward an inevitable, catastrophic crash that tore the dreamscape apart. When the violent chaos of the crash finally subsided, Nick found himself jarringly transported to the pristine, sprawling grounds of the Newman Ranch. The stark, silent beauty of the estate stood in horrifying contrast to the violence he had just experienced. The tranquility of the ranch, however, was immediately shattered by the agonizing, guttural screams echoing from the main house. Nick stumbled toward the source of the sound, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, only to discover Adam and Chelsea Lawson completely consumed by an apocalyptic, world-ending grief. The sheer magnitude of their sorrow was a physical force, radiating outward and suffocating the very air in the room. They looked at Nick not with anger, but with a horrifying, absolute devastation that chilled him to the core of his being. The source of their unimaginable agony was quickly and brutally revealed to him. Through the fractured narrative of the dream, Nick was forced to confront the ultimate, unforgivable consequence of his reckless addiction. Adam and Chelsea, their voices cracking with unspeakable pain, explained that Nick had carelessly left his hidden stash of lethal fentanyl exposed within the house. Driven by innocent curiosity, young Connor Newman had discovered the toxic substance. The revelation struck Nick with the force of a physical blow, shattering his reality entirely as he realized that his own personal demons had directly resulted in a fatal overdose, claiming the life of his innocent nephew. The unbearable, suffocating weight of a guilt so profound it threatened to permanently extinguish his sanity descended upon him, anchoring him to the floor in a state of paralyzing horror. The punishment for this unimaginable sin was swiftly delivered by the grieving parents. Adam and Chelsea, their sorrow hardening into an impenetrable, protective resolve, declared with absolute certainty that they would never allow Nick to cause such destruction again. They relentlessly proclaimed their intention to take Christian away from him, vowing to shield the young boy from the toxic, lethal influence of a father who had proven himself entirely incapable of providing safety. The threat of losing Christian, of being completely and utterly stripped of his identity as a father, was the final, devastating blow. Nick felt his entire world collapse inward, leaving him a hollow, terrified shell of a man. Unable to bear the crushing weight of their judgment and the reality of his actions, Nick turned and fled from the ranch, running blindly back into the terrifying void of his own mind. His cowardly retreat inevitably pulled him back to the familiar, neon-lit darkness of the shadow room. The cyclical, inescapable nature of his addiction drew him like a magnet back to the source of his ruin. As he stumbled through the doors, panting and broken, a faceless dealer immediately approached, offering him the ultimate, chemical escape from the unbearable agony of his perceived sins. Nick's hand trembled as he reached for the illicit solace, the gravitational pull of his dependency proving entirely overwhelming. However, before he could cross that final threshold into complete oblivion, the imposing, authoritative figures of Victor and Nicky Newman materialized from the shadows, their presence demanding an immediate and terrifying reckoning. The towering disappointment radiating from the Newman patriarch was a palpable, crushing force, but it was the profound collapse of his mother that truly destroyed Nick. Nicky, her face etched with a sorrow that mirrored his own, delivered a devastating confession that shattered the foundational pillars of their family. She revealed that her marriage to Victor had been entirely destroyed once again, a catastrophic separation that she placed squarely on Nick's shoulders. She explained that Victor had relentlessly blamed her for being a toxic influence, holding her responsible for Nick's downward spiral. The horrifying climax of this familial destruction unfolded before Nick's very eyes as Nikki, driven to absolute, unbearable despair by the failures of her son, turned to the bartender and ordered a double vodka. Nick watched in paralyzing, agonizing helplessness as his mother intentionally shattered her hard-won sobriety, sacrificing her own salvation because she could no longer bear the weight of his tragic downfall. The sheer horror of witnessing his mother's relapse triggered a sudden, jarring shift in the dreamscape, creating a false awakening that deposited Nick back into the grim reality of his motel room. He gasped for air, believing he had escaped the nightmare, only to find the cold, unyielding figure of Victoria Newman standing over him. The judgment in her eyes was absolute and unforgiving. Desperate for absolution, Nick offered a frantic stream of hollow promises, swearing that he would reform, that he would conquer his demons and return to the family fold. Victoria, however, remained entirely unmoved by his desperate pleas. She delivered the cold, hard truth with surgical precision, making it abundantly clear that his empty words were entirely meaningless. She demanded actual, tangible salvation, insisting that he must put forth real, agonizing effort to earn his redemption, rather than simply offering the same broken promises that had led him to this miserable state. Before Nick could formulate a response to his sister's devastating ultimatum, a violent, relentless knocking shattered the atmosphere of the room. The sound was deafening, a physical assault that finally tore him from the suffocating, paralyzing grip of the nightmare. Nick jolted upright in the motel bed, his body drenched in a cold, heavy sweat, his heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. The residual terror of his subconscious mind clung to him like a second skin, leaving him gasping for breath in the dim, flickering light of the room. The knocking continued, an urgent, demanding rhythm that forced him to confront the waking world. Trembling and profoundly disoriented, Nick dragged himself toward the door, the echoes of Cassie's judgment, Connor's fate, and Nicky's relapse still ringing in his ears. He turned the handle and pulled the door open, expecting to find the harsh reality of his isolation. Instead, he was met by the mysterious, alluring presence of Marie Kirkland. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, Marie represented an entirely new, unpredictable element in his chaotic life. She probed him with intense, knowing questions, revealing that she had heard his agonizing screams echoing through the thin walls of the motel. As she gently asked if he needed to share the heavy burden he was carrying, a dangerous, intoxicating realization washed over Nick. Instead of reaching out to the family he had just dreamed of destroying, he felt an immediate, magnetic pull toward this stranger. The unresolved tension hung heavily in the air, signaling the terrifying beginning of a deeply toxic, codependent sanctuary, a dangerous turning point where Nick, desperate for understanding without judgment, was poised to plunge even deeper into the darkness, alongside a woman who could ultimately accelerate his tragic, inescapable downfall.